What happens when we lower our hiring standards to fill nursing gaps? That is what Dr. Caldwell said 43 minutes before Major Dominic Hayes coded in room for 12. Rachel Torres adjusted the 4-drip calibration under fluorescent lights in Cedar Creek Medical, her hand steady despite the antiseptic smell mixing with tension. The temp nurse from the registry wore faded scrubs, her movements efficient as she checked vitals on the Special Forces major recovering from a convoy explosion. A tarnished challenge coin sat in her scrub pocket, its weight familiar against her thigh. The scar tissue on her left shoulder pulled tight when she reached for the blood pressure cuff. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Caldwell was already walking toward her with his residents trailing behind like remoras following a shark, and he wasn't coming to check on Major Hayes. He was coming to use her. He gestured at Rachel's technique with the 4-line as if presenting a cautionary tale at grand rounds. His voice carried across the trauma unit with deliberate clarity, each word chosen to land like a scalpel. This, he said, nodding toward her patient, is what happens when we lower our hiring standards to fill nursing gaps. Registry temps. No institutional loyalty. No accountability. The resident smirked. One of them whispered something. Another laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her jaw stayed relaxed. Her hands remained steady calibrating the drip rate for Major Hayes, her touch so precise that the medication flow didn't waver even 1 unit per hour. She had been trained to work under pressure that made medical school residencies look like orientation day. Mockery from a doctor who'd probably never performed battlefield triage was not going to shake her concentration. The Major's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. Oxygen sat was 94%. Blood pressure holding at 128/82. The monitors sang their mechanical chorus, steady beeps that meant he was alive because someone with actual skill had kept him that way while surgeons consulted with each other about what to do next. Caldwell lingered near the bedside, waiting. Waiting for her to say something back. Waiting for her to tremble or defend herself or show him the satisfaction of her breaking. He had no idea that the woman his residents were mocking had spent 6 years as a surgical specialist in FOB Shank, Loga Province, where every decision with a scalpel happened in 15 minutes or the patient died before medevac arrived. He had no idea that she'd trained under Master Chief Jackson Clayton, the man whose insignia was stamped into the challenge coin currently resting against her hip. Rachel felt the coin's weight shift as she leaned forward to check the cardiac monitor. She glanced down at it through her scrub pocket, just for half a second, and the insignia caught the light. There it was. The same crossed tridents. The same anchor. The same unit crest that her son Marcus wore under his own uniform, the same crest that appeared on every intelligence briefing about Task Force 121's area of operations in the Hindu Kush. Major Dominic Hayes had commanded the unit where her son currently served. Had served. Probably still serving, if the security clearance renewal forms she'd signed last month meant anything. Caldwell moved away, satisfied that he'd landed his blow. The residents followed him like ducklings, their laughter fading as they turned the corner toward the conference room. Rachel stayed with Major Hayes, her fingers finding his wrist for a manual pulse check. Strong. Regular. Alive. The thing about Caldwell that most people didn't understand was that his humiliation wasn't random. It was precision-targeted cruelty. And it had nothing to do with nursing standards. She'd noticed it 3 weeks ago, the supply charges that didn't match actual inventory. The diagnostic equipment billing that appeared on charts for patients who'd never been scanned. The phantom physical therapy sessions logged for discharged patients. Roughly $800,000 in discrepancies since she'd arrived. The kind of money that required systematic coordination, not mistakes. The kind of money that required someone with access to the billing system, the inventory control, and the authority to approve the charges without questions. Someone like a department head who controlled which vendors got approved and which patients got assigned to which units. Someone like Dr. Caldwell. Rachel had documented it quietly. She'd photographed the supply logs. Cross-referenced them with hospital records. Pulled the insurance billing statements. She hadn't told anyone yet, hadn't had time to decide whether to report it internally or take it straight to the state insurance board. But Caldwell had sensed something. Had seen her lingering near the supply audit terminal. Had noticed her writing down vendor names. And now he was making sure she'd be gone before those discrepancies became anyone else's problem. The afternoon shift was already thinning out when Caldwell appeared at the vending machine outside the break room, blocking Rachel's path with the kind of casualness that screamed calculation. She'd come down for water, just water, nothing that required conversation. But Caldwell had positioned himself between her and the machine like a triage nurse deciding who got treatment first. "Registry temps don't typically last long here," he said, his voice the kind of pleasant that made poison tea seem friendly. He was holding a coffee that he clearly hadn't wanted to drink. Just something to hold. A prop for this conversation. The benefits package isn't what most agencies advertise. No retirement. No pension match. Health insurance kicks in after 90 days, and most of you don't stay that long. Rachel moved to her left. Caldwell shifted right, blocking her path again. "I wonder what that means for someone's ability to afford snacks," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the machine. "Maybe you're more of a water person. That makes sense. Economical." She could have said something. Could have made a comment about his commentary. Instead, she simply stood there, her breathing slow and measured, her eyes fixed on the water button. Waiting. The way a trained operator waits for the moment to move. Caldwell smiled. The smile of someone who thought silence meant surrender. Security escorts for terminated staff are scheduled for Friday afternoons. Just a heads up. In case you need to plan accordingly. We do like to keep things orderly. Professional. You understand. He said nothing else. Just moved aside and walked back down the corridor, his shoes making soft clicking sounds against the tile floor, each step a metronome counting down something Rachel couldn't quite hear. She got her water. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that sound that never quite stops once you notice it, the electric whine of hospital infrastructure running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, keeping people alive whether the people running the place deserved to keep their licenses or not. Rachel stood alone in the break room for approximately 90 seconds, the challenge coin's weight suddenly very noticeable in her scrub pocket. Major Dominic Hayes. 6 combat deployments. 3 Purple Hearts. The man who'd sent a handwritten note after a battalion-wide briefing to say thank you to the medical specialists who'd kept his unit functional in theater. The man whose sister Marcus mentioned in letters home. The man who was upstairs in room for 12 recovering from a blast that should have killed him. The man she'd been told to save. She pressed the water bottle against her forehead. Cool condensation. Familiar. Grounding. Down the corridor, somewhere near the billing office, Dr. Caldwell was probably already making phone calls. Calling board members. Calling registry managers. Calling anyone who owed him a favor, building a story where Rachel Torres wasn't just a temp nurse, she was a liability. A security risk. A problem that needed solving by Friday. What they didn't know was that Friday was going to come and go, and Rachel would still be standing. But first, she needed to know what was going to happen when Major Hayes' heart stopped beating. When the shift ended at 1900, Rachel headed toward the employee exit and reached for her badge. The magnetic lock beeped red. Denied. She tried again. Red. Denied. The security guard behind the desk didn't look up from his phone until she approached the window. My badge isn't working. He checked his screen, then her face, his expression shifting into something practiced and apologetic. Your access was deactivated at 1847. You'll need to check with HR. The hallway tilted slightly. Rachel moved toward the locker room with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her hand stayed steady as she gathered her personal items, a spare pair of compression socks, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, the framed photo of Marcus in his dress uniform that she kept face down in the bottom drawer. The challenge coin stayed in her scrub pocket where it always was, worn smooth by 4 years of rotation between her fingers during quiet moments. She was still in scrubs when 2 security officers appeared at the employee exit. Not the usual guards who waved staff through. These were different men, contracted security with the flat eyes of people following a script, professional enough to be thorough, young enough to be uncertain. One of them held a clipboard. "Ms. Torres? We'll need to escort you from the building." Rachel nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She simply walked toward them with the same composure she'd maintained through grand rounds, through Caldwell's vending machine commentary, through the casual threat about Friday terminations. The coin pressed against her ribs as she moved. The escort took for minutes. Down the corridor past the break room where the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless mechanical rhythm, past the unit secretary's station where someone had left a half-finished cup of coffee, through the sliding doors that opened with a pneumatic hiss and then sealed shut behind her. The San Antonio evening wrapped around her like something heavy, humid air that tasted of diesel from the loading dock and antiseptic that never quite washed out of clothing. One guard stood at her car. The other remained near the hospital entrance, watching. Rachel unlocked her 2009 Honda Civic, placed her work bag on the passenger seat, and pulled out of Cedar Creek Medical without turning back. The parking lot surveillance cameras tracked her the entire way. She knew they did. The drive home took 17 minutes. She knew because she timed it in her head, counting seconds the way she'd been trained to count pulse rates and breaths and the duration of chest compressions. 2,200 beats per minute of her own heart against her ribs. At a red light on Blanco Road, her phone buzzed. A text from the registry coordinator, Cedar Creek Medical has terminated your assignment effective immediately. Breach of protocol. Will contact regarding final paperwork. No details. No explanation. Just erasure. In the kitchen of her small house, Rachel sat at the table where she'd lived for 4 years without living, where bills were paid and coffee was made and the silence was never interrupted except by Marcus's occasional satellite calls from deployments she couldn't discuss. The challenge coin emerged from her pocket. Tarnished silver with the insignia of a Master Chief Petty Officer embossed into its face, the edges worn rough by shrapnel that had taken her across a mountain in 2009 when she was something other than just a nurse, just a registry temp, just a woman who could be terminated before Friday. The coin rotated between her fingers, clockwise, counterclockwise, clockwise, a rhythm older than her civilian life, muscle memory from a time when she'd been called something different, trained for something different, trusted with things that no longer existed. The tears came silently. No sound, no tremor in her shoulders, no evidence except the way her vision blurred and the liquid warmth tracked down her face. She was past the age of loud grief. Past the age of anything that advertised pain. But alone at a kitchen table at 2,100 hours with a coin that proved she'd once been extraordinary, the body's betrayal was almost acceptable. Her phone rang at 22:45. Marcus. Hey, Mom. Rough shift? She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye. When she spoke, her voice carried no inflection. Just tired. You okay? You sound, I don't know. Different. I'm fine, sweetheart. How's deployment? Same. Hot. Boring until it isn't. But Major Hayes, the one I mentioned, is actually incredible. He was asking about you again today. Said something about how you worked at Cedar Creek, and he owes you. Mom, what did you do for this guy? Rachel's jaw clenched. Hayes had led the unit. Hayes had been in the convoy. Hayes had survived because she'd held pressure on a femoral bleed with her own hands while rounds came through the windshield, because a medic had trained her in 2008 to recognize shock before you could see it, before the body gave up. Hayes had lived because some wounds aren't the kind that show on X-rays. I just know him from the hospital. That's weird because he made it sound like, Marcus, I need to tell you something. The pause on the satellite line stretched like a taut cable. Okay. What? Rachel stared at the challenge coin. At the proof that somewhere in classified databases and locked vaults, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres still existed in files marked compartmentalized. At the consequence of that existence deciding to walk into Cedar Creek Medical as a temp nurse and stay long enough to notice billing discrepancies. I can't. Not over the phone. Not now. Is this about the job? Are you in trouble? Just listen. If anything happens, if you ever need to know, there's a name written inside a book on the top shelf of my closet. Behind the copy of Catch 22. You call that number if you ever need to, and you don't tell anyone you have it. Not your command. Not anyone. Mom, you're scaring me. I know. I'm sorry. I love you. She hung up before he could press further. The kitchen fell into silence again, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren on IO-37, heading toward someone else's emergency. Rachel sat with the challenge coin rotating, the weight of full years of invisibility finally becoming something visible in the absence of her badge, in the absence of the job that had given her a reason to exist in civilian form. At 0247, her phone buzzed again. An email from Cedar Creek Medical's HR department, copying the state nursing board, copying what appeared to be a personal attorney. The subject line read, Notice of Termination and Complaint, Breach of Scope of Practice. Caldwell hadn't wasted time. He'd activated his network with the efficiency of someone who'd calculated exactly which threads to pull. The email cited gross procedural violations, referenced unauthorized medical intervention, and attached a complaint allegedly filed by an anonymous staff member regarding her dangerous incompetence. The language was precise enough to sound credible to anyone who didn't understand the work, vague enough to be legally defensible, and positioned to trigger a state board investigation that could suspend her license before she had a chance to defend herself. The second email came from the registry coordinator. Cedar Creek Medical has filed a complaint with the State Board of Nursing regarding your certification. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all registry assignments pending investigation. This applies to all hospitals in Texas. We regret. Rachel didn't finish reading. She understood the architecture of it. Caldwell had made calls, one to a board member who owed him favors, extracting whatever backstory he could demand, another to the registry director to request her full personnel file, a third to file an anonymous complaint that would activate investigative machinery that moved slowly but moved in only one direction. By morning, Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres would be officially terminated from civilian life again. This time with a different kind of erasure. Not from classified documents but from the mundane world where she'd tried to become invisible for Marcus's sake, to be a nurse instead of what she actually was. She rotated the challenge coin again. Clockwise. The metal was cold. The weight was familiar. In a few hours, Marcus would wake to the reality that his mother had just lost the job that explained her absence, explained why she worked nights and kept her past locked away, explained why she couldn't answer his questions about Major Hayes or tell him why a man who'd served under her command was now his superior officer. She couldn't tell him that the woman who'd raised him while he slept had spent a decade training to do the things that got you erased from records. That the quiet nurse who'd taken registry assignments to stay beneath institutional notice had once been dangerous enough to matter to people who made decisions in windowless rooms. The silence in the kitchen was so thick you could operate in it. The next morning, Rachel arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 06:45, badge still clipped to her lanyard, scrubs pressed despite the sleepless night. The charge nurse, Patricia, wouldn't meet her eyes. Your assignment's changed. You've got rooms 304 through 309 today. Stable patients only. Dr. Caldwell's orders. Rachel's jaw didn't move. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded and picked up the patient charts, already knowing what she'd find. Major Dominic Hayes' name was gone from her roster. Transferred to a newer nurse, Stephanie, who had 6 months' experience and the kind of eager optimism that came from not yet understanding how hospitals actually worked. Rachel had trained 3 nurses like Stephanie. She'd held their hands through their first code blue. She knew exactly what happened when inexperience met deterioration. By 0800, Caldwell was standing at the charge nurse's desk, arms folded across his chest like a man protecting something. "We're redistributing the complex cases to permanent staff," he announced, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "Registry temps handle the stable patients. Hospital policy. Liability concerns." His eyes found Rachel across the unit. She was charting on a tablet, her posture exactly the same as it had been when he'd mocked her in grand rounds, shoulders relaxed, hands steady, the kind of composure that made him grind his teeth because it meant his words weren't landing. The challenge coin was in her scrub pocket. He'd noticed it yesterday, tarnished and worn, the kind of cheap souvenir people picked up at gift shops. He didn't know what it was. He didn't care. It was just another thing about her that suggested she was beneath the institution he'd spent 23 years building. By noon, Rachel discovered her electronic access to Major Hayes's medical records had been restricted. She tried pulling his chart, access denied. She tried again. Same error message. The system administrator, when she called, offered an apologetic voice. "Dr. Caldwell placed a restriction this morning. Liability concerns with registry staff accessing complex cases. You should have been notified." Rachel thanked her and hung up without comment. She understood what was happening. This wasn't incompetence. This was strategy. This was the systematic removal of her ability to help. Caldwell was building a paper trail, establishing a narrative. The temp nurse is restricted from patient care because she's a liability. The restriction itself was the evidence he'd use later. She'd seen this before, in different contexts, in different countries, in situations where institutional enemies needed to be eliminated cleanly. The goal was to make her termination look inevitable, not retaliatory. At 14:30, a new policy appeared in her email inbox. Enhanced Procedural Review Protocol for Registry Staff. All of Rachel's charting would now be flagged for real-time supervisor review. All of her medication administrations would require a second signature. All of her assessments would be documented in triplicate for quality assurance purposes. The language was clinical and neutral. The meaning was crystal clear. Everything she did would be scrutinized, documented, and filed away as potential evidence of incompetence. Caldwell was creating a case. He was building a case the way you'd build a fortress, brick by brick, documentation by documentation, each policy change another layer of protection for the narrative he was constructing. By the time he fired her, there would be a file so thick with complaints and restrictions that anyone who looked at it would assume she'd been a liability from the start. Rachel continued working. She checked vital signs for her stable patients with the same precision she'd used when she was checking vital signs in a combat hospital in Kandahar province. She documented her assessments in clinical language that couldn't be twisted or misinterpreted. She responded to call lights immediately. She was, quite deliberately, performing competence like a skilled musician performs a concerto, every note exactly right, every phrase perfect, nothing that could be used against her. Because she understood now that Caldwell wasn't just trying to fire her. He was trying to ensure that no one could ever question the firing. He needed her gone because she'd noticed something that could destroy him, and he needed her destruction to look routine, inevitable, professional. But that wasn't the worst part. By 1900, Major Hayes's condition began deteriorating in ways that made Rachel's chest tighten even though she was no longer assigned to his care. She was in room 307, helping an 84-year-old man with pneumonia adjust his oxygen, when she heard the monitor alarm from Hayes's room down the hall. Not a momentary irregularity. A sustained alarm. His blood pressure dropping. Heart rate climbing. The sound was like a voice calling through fog. Rachel glanced down the hallway and saw Stephanie, the newer nurse, standing at the bedside with panic flickering across her face, the kind of panic that came when the patient stopped following the rules you'd learned in nursing school. Stephanie paged Caldwell. Once. Twice. 3 times. No response. Rachel finished adjusting her patient's oxygen and stepped into the hallway. She could see Hayes's vital signs on the central monitor from 30 feet away, BP 94/58 and falling, heart rate 136, respiratory rate 22. The progression was textbook cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulating around the heart, restricting the organ's ability to pump. Every second mattered. She checked the clock, 19:07. The on-call cardiothoracic surgeon was at San Antonio Medical, 8 miles away, minimum 30-minute transport time. She moved toward Hayes's room and the charge nurse, Patricia, physically stepped into her path. "You're not assigned to this patient, Torres. Step back." Her voice was apologetic but firm, orders from above, nothing personal. Rachel glanced through the open doorway. Hayes's neck veins were distending, a visible swelling that meant his venous pressure was climbing, that his heart was filling when it should have been pumping. His breathing had become shallow, rapid, labored. The kind of breathing that came when the body knew something was profoundly wrong. Caldwell appeared then, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He took one look at Hayes, ordered a stat bedside ultrasound, and positioned himself at the foot of the bed like a director surveying his stage. The ultrasound tech arrived in under 4 minutes. The image appeared on the monitor, pericardial fluid visible as a dark crescent surrounding the heart muscle. Caldwell exhaled slowly through his nose. "Significant accumulation," he said to the attending, a surgical resident named Chen who looked like she was 6 weeks into her career. "Too advanced to move him to the OR. Transport will kill him. We keep him stable, manage his fluid status, hope the cardiac surgeons can intervene before it progresses." He glanced at Rachel standing in the hallway, her badge hanging exactly where it had been during grand rounds, her hand steady, her face a mask of professional detachment. "And keep unauthorized personnel away from this room. I don't need registry temps complicating my documentation." The words landed like they were supposed to, a public reminder of her status, her restrictions, her place in the hierarchy. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She simply turned and walked back toward room 307, where her stable patient was waiting, his oxygen saturation improving because she had adjusted the flow rate correctly, because she had decades of experience encoded in her muscle memory, because some knowledge couldn't be taken away by policy changes or access restrictions or public humiliation. Behind her, she heard Caldwell continuing his assessment, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had solved the problem of Major Dominic Hayes by deciding that Hayes's deterioration was inevitable, manageable, something that could be documented and absorbed into the statistics of medical practice. She knew what would come next. Hayes would continue to decline through the evening because Caldwell had essentially written him off, had decided that the risk of intervention outweighed the benefit. Caldwell would document every moment of the decline. 1945 shows persistent tachycardia. 2000 BP continues to drop despite fluid boluses. 2030 patient becoming increasingly somnolent, presumed end-stage tamponade. The narrative would be constructed in real time, each note a brick in the wall that separated Caldwell from responsibility. And Rachel would sit with her stable patients, charting in triplicate, performing competence like a prisoner performs compliance, knowing that every correct action was being filed away and that somewhere in the administrative machinery of Cedar Creek Medical, someone was building the case that would end her employment. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt heavier than it should. She'd kept it for 13 years, had carried it through desk jobs and corporate nursing and the carefully constructed anonymity of registry work. It was tarnished now, worn smooth by 13 years of her fingers finding it in moments of doubt. It bore the insignia of JSOC Task Force 121, the call sign of a Master Chief Petty Officer who'd performed battlefield triage in Kandahar province when Caldwell was still learning how to interpret EKGs from textbooks. The coin represented a woman who no longer officially existed, who had signed away her identity and her career and the right to use her own name in exchange for the safety of people she loved. And now that woman was watching from the hallway as a man she'd seen coming from 1,000 miles away slowly executed the machinery of her professional destruction, and she was powerless to stop it because the moment she revealed herself, the moment she stepped outside her assigned role, everything would collapse. She finished her charting at 21:45. All notes entered. All medications documented. All assessments clinically precise and impossible to challenge. She clocked out at 2155 and walked to the parking lot where San Antonio's heat radiated up from the asphalt like breath from something sleeping. In her car, before she turned the key in the ignition, she pulled out the challenge coin and let it catch the fluorescent light from the parking lot lamps. It gleamed for just a moment, and then she closed her hand around it and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of all the years she'd spent being invisible, all the people she'd helped without them knowing who she was, all the deaths she'd prevented while maintaining the fiction that she was ordinary. Tomorrow would bring new restrictions. New policies. New opportunities for Caldwell to build his case. And Rachel would meet each one with the same precision, the same composure, the same refusal to give him legitimate grounds for termination. Because she understood something that Caldwell didn't understand about people like her, people trained to function under pressure, to make decisions in conditions of uncertainty, to keep working even when the mission seemed impossible. They didn't break. They didn't retreat. They endured. And they waited. Because waiting was sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do. At 0200 hours, the monitor's rhythm degraded from irregular to desperate. Muffled heart sounds. Distended neck veins like taut cables beneath Major Hayes's skin. Blood pressure 70/40 and falling, the numbers bleeding downward with each passing second. Rachel moved to the doorway of room for 12 and saw the attending physician studying the ultrasound, his jaw locked tight. Massive fluid accumulation around the heart. Cardiac tamponade. The kind of diagnosis that made surgeons famous or made families grieve. He won't survive transport, the attending said quietly, his voice carrying the resignation of a man who had already written the ending. Surgeon still 28 minutes out. Moving him now will drop his pressure to 0 before we reach the OR. Caldwell stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, checking his watch with the casual precision of a man timing something routine. Then we've done everything we can, he said. Document the timeline. Note that surgical intervention was unavailable. Get the family on the phone if they haven't arrived yet. He turned toward the hallway, his residents trailing behind like disciples who had just been granted permission to abandon their faith. Rachel watched 3 doctors file out of room for 12. Not looking back. Not looking at Major Hayes. Their faces wore the same expression she'd seen 1,000 times in 18 years, the hollow resignation of professionals surrendering to the mathematics of mortality. The hallway cleared. Machines beeped their lonely rhythm. Rachel waited until Caldwell's footsteps faded toward the attending's office, then stepped inside room for 12 and locked the door from the inside. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was like drawing a sword. Her hands moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory taking over, the kind of instinctive precision that came from performing the same procedure under mortar fire outside Bagram in 2009 with rounds impacting the concrete walls and a 19-year-old Marine's lung collapsing on the stretcher in front of her. The emergency pericardiocentesis kit came from the crash cart with the weight of purpose. Sterile drape. Chlorhexidine swab. 18-gauge needle. She prepped the subxiphoid approach, the soft triangle of skin and cartilage beneath Major Hayes's sternum where the needle could reach the pericardial sac without puncturing the heart itself. Stay with me, Major, Rachel said quietly, and his eyes focused on her face, aware, terrified, and trusting in a way that made the moment sacred. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, guided by the architecture of his own anatomy, by 2 decades of repetition, by the particular kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Her hand was steady as a surgical laser. The metal shaft slid through skin and fascia and serous membrane until she felt the subtle change in resistance, that peculiar give that meant the needle had reached the fluid-filled space around his failing heart. She pulled back slowly on the plunger. Dark blood filled the syringe. Not bright arterial red. Dark venous blood, tamponade blood, the fluid that was crushing Major Hayes's heart with each beat. Rachel withdrew the needle in one smooth motion and secured the drainage catheter in place, leaving a path for the fluid to drain and for his heart to beat without obstruction. 30 seconds. That's all the procedure took. The monitor sound changed first, the pitch of the beeping shifted upward, the rhythm stabilizing, Hayes's blood pressure climbing like a man being pulled up from drowning. 80/50. Then 90/60. His breathing deepened. Color returned to his face in a wash of sudden life. Rachel stood beside the bed, her hands already moving to chart the procedure with the same calm precision she'd used to perform it, noting the time, the fluid output, the patient's response, the present sinus rhythm, each word dropping onto the screen with the weight of testimony. She was still charting when Caldwell's master key override clicked the lock open 10 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway, and Rachel watched his face complete a transformation in real time, the shock of finding Hayes not dead but stable, the monitors showing normal rhythms, the 4 lines running clear, and Rachel standing there in her scrubs with his patient alive. His complexion shifted from pale to crimson, the color climbing his neck like fire-consuming paper. "What have you done?" he whispered. Rachel didn't look up from the computer. "Performed emergency pericardiocentesis. Drained 1,200 milliliters of fluid from the pericardial sac. Patient responding well to intervention. You have no authority to." "Your surgeon was 28 minutes away," Rachel said, her voice flat and factual as a statement read into the record. "Major Hayes would have been dead in 6. Caldwell's jaw clenched so hard the ligaments in his neck stood out like rope. He left without another word, his footsteps moving fast toward the hallway, his phone already in his hand. Rachel heard his voice rising as he made the first call, to a board member at the country club who owed him favors from a land development deal, a voice pitched to sound injured and professional, a narrative being established like foundation poured before the structure rises. The second call came within 15 minutes, his tone dropping lower, more intimate, the registry director, a mutual friend from a medical conference in Denver, Caldwell's words careful and measured and laced with concern about overstepping protocols and the temp nurse performing invasive procedures without proper oversight. The third call happened in the hallway outside Hayes's room at 03 for 7 hours. Rachel heard it through the door. "State Nursing Board?" "Yes, hello, I need to report an incident of practicing outside the scope of a nursing license. No, I can't provide my name, but this is a patient safety issue." His voice dropped to a confidential whisper. "The individual involved, we've since learned, is a registry employee with an unclear employment history." By 0500, Caldwell had made 4 calls total. By 0530, the hospital CEO's chief of staff was sending emails to security. By 0600, 2 security guards appeared at the nurse's station with the walking gait of men executing a decision that had already been made, that didn't require further input or negotiation. They said her name like it was a procedure to be completed. "Rachel Torres, you need to come with us." Caldwell stood behind them with the expression of a man who had just won something, his voice carrying down the hallway with the clarity of victory broadcast, gross procedural violations. Unauthorized invasive intervention. Immediate termination. Escort her out, she doesn't collect personal items, she doesn't access hospital systems, she leaves now. The security guards were polite about it. Professional. One of them, an older man with silver temples and tired eyes, actually looked uncomfortable as he walked beside her toward the staff exit, the fluorescent lights overhead casting the hallway in that particular shade of institutional white that made everything look temporary and unreal. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance nobody had wanted to witness. She could have fought it. Could have called the Texas Board of Nursing herself, could have documented the hours and minutes, could have brought witnesses. Instead, she walked through the rain in her scrubs, her security badge already deactivated, the challenge coin still rotating between the fingers of her right hand beneath the thin fabric of her pocket. The rain soaked through her scrubs. She didn't feel it. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it would reshape the foundation of Cedar Creek Medical in ways nobody could yet imagine. 3 days later, the trauma bay doors burst open at Cedar Creek Medical, and the team scrambled into motion. A stretcher rolled through, paramedics calling vitals, gunshot wound to the abdomen, blood loss significant, airway patent but barely. The attending physician barked orders while nurses prepped the trauma suite. The patient's name was Khalid, according to the paramedic report. Afghan national. Shot during a grocery store robbery in South San Antonio. Low blood pressure. High heart rate. Time was the enemy, and everyone in that room knew it. The attending leaned in, scanning the wound, already calculating the odds. "Who was that nurse they fired last week?" he said absently, glancing at the chart. The one who saved Major Hayes? Registry temp. Khalid's eyes snapped open. His hand shot out, grabbing the attending's wrist with surprising strength for a man losing blood. Katila, he whispered, his voice raw with pain and something else, recognition. Recognition and fear. Katila. Where is Katila? The room froze. Nobody moved for 3 seconds. The veteran security guard, Marcus Chen, 23 years on hospital security, former Marine, felt the word hit him like a physical blow. Katila. The killer. That was what the Taliban called her in Helmand province, what they'd whispered in compounds from Sanjan Valley to Logar. He'd been part of the unit that extracted her in 2011, part of the Black Ops team that pulled her out of that compound in the middle of the night, bleeding from shrapnel wounds that should have killed her. He'd watched her fold herself into the Chinook helicopter and disappear into classified records. Marcus stepped forward, his badge catching the fluorescent light. I know her, he said quietly. His voice had dropped an octave, the same command tone he'd used in the field. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. Naval Special Warfare. 6 combat deployments. 2 Navy Crosses. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. She saved that Afghan interpreter's life in 2009. Bagram. Blown Humvee outside the base. She did the same thing she did for Major Hayes, refused to let someone die on her watch. The attending stared at him. The trauma team stared at him. Khalid closed his eyes, tears tracking down his face. The doors opened again. This time, it wasn't a stretcher. A 2-star general walked into the trauma bay, his dress uniform immaculate, his presence making the air pressure in the room change. Behind him came another officer, and another, and the entire medical team instinctively straightened. This wasn't protocol. This was something else entirely. I need the attending physician, the general said. His voice was quiet. That made it worse. The attending stepped forward, confused, his hand still gloved in blood. The general pulled a file from his aide's briefcase, thick, classified, marked with security stamps that meant federal jurisdiction. Rachel Torres served under my command, the general said. He opened the file. Photos spilled out. Combat scenes. Medical operations. Rachel in a field hospital, her hand steady as surgical lasers, working under fire. Rachel carrying a wounded soldier through smoke. Rachel's face in a tactical report, her eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic. 6 combat deployments. 2004 to 2010. First deployment was Bagram, 2004. She was 24 years old. She saved 47 lives in that first tour alone. He turned a page. Bronze Star Favela. First deployment. Another page turned. Silver Star. Second deployment. Another page. And then the Purple Hearts. Shrapnel from an IED blast in 2007. Should have ended her career. Should have ended her life. The general's jaw tightened. She went back for her team instead. Carried 3 men to the extraction site with a punctured lung and 3 pieces of shrapnel still embedded. Refused medical evacuation until they were loaded on the bird. Major Hayes stood in the doorway, still in his hospital gown, for still taped to his arm, looking like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of command authority. This woman saved my life 72 hours ago. Locked a door. Performed emergency pericardiocentesis when every attending in this hospital had already written me off as dead. He looked at the general. Sir, with respect, she's the best tactical field medic I've ever served with, and I've served with the 75th Ranger Regiment and Joint Task Force Peninsula. What happened to her was unconscionable. The general's eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in every face. When he spoke again, his voice was steel. Where is Dr. Caldwell? The CEO, standing at the back of the trauma bay, made a small sound in his throat. His office, he managed. 3rd floor, East Wing. The general nodded to one of his officers, who turned and moved with purpose. 30 seconds later, a phone call came through to hospital administration. Dr. Caldwell's office was empty. His desk had been cleared. His car was no longer in the physician parking lot. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Caldwell was already 60 miles north of San Antonio, his hands shaking as he drove. What Caldwell didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly have understood, was that attempting to modify a registry personnel file flagged for military service personnel triggered an automatic federal review. The FBI field office in San Antonio had received the alert at 1,440 hours. The very moment he'd entered those false disciplinary notes, the very second he'd marked Rachel's profile with a security risk designation, he'd activated a protocol that had been waiting in the federal system since 2011. 2 FBI agents were dispatched to Cedar Creek Medical at 14:55. By 15:20, they'd already interviewed the CEO, pulled Caldwell's billing authorizations for the past 48 months, and identified the pattern. Phantom equipment charges. Inflated supply costs. Markups that didn't match hospital standard pricing. $847,000 in systematic insurance fraud spanning 2 years. The forged personnel records were the final piece, evidence of obstruction of justice, witness tampering, falsification of federal records. At 1,600 hours, FBI agents found Caldwell at his home on Blue Ridge Drive, suitcase half-packed on his bed. They placed him in handcuffs on his front lawn while his neighbors watched from their windows. His wife stood in the doorway, her face blank with shock, her hand pressed against the jamb as if the house itself might collapse. The lead agent read the charges: healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, falsifying federal records. Caldwell's knees buckled. The handcuffs caught him, held him up, held him forward. News cameras captured the perp walk at the federal building that evening, his expensive suit rumpled, his face gray as ash, his attorney jogging behind the agents shouting about bail considerations and preliminary hearings. His medical license was suspended within 24 hours. His name was flagged in every major hospital system in Texas. His career didn't just end. It was erased, the same way he'd tried to erase Rachel. 6 months later, Rachel walked past a strip mall office park on the south side of San Antonio, her stride confident in the afternoon sun. The day was warm, the kind of Texas heat that made the asphalt shimmer, and her shadow on the pavement was sharp and defined. Behind a glass window, Dr. Caldwell sat at a folding table beneath a faded banner reading Affordable Insurance Solutions. His tie was loosened. His eyes were hollow. He was explaining policy options to an elderly couple who looked skeptical, who didn't understand why his hands trembled when he handed them the paperwork, who had no idea they were sitting across from a man whose entire world had compressed into this single folding table in a strip mall. Rachel didn't break stride. Didn't slow. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't give him the satisfaction of recognition. She shifted the Cedar Creek Medical badge on her lanyard, the new one, the one that read Director of Emergency Services, and kept walking. The weight of it against her chest was solid and earned. In her pocket, the tarnished military challenge coin felt warm, familiar. Major Hayes had given it back to her that morning, pressed it into her palm with a salute that said everything words couldn't express. On the back, he'd inscribed new words. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. At the hospital, her son Marcus waited in dress uniform, home on leave from his unit. He stood at attention beside Major Hayes, both men straightening when they saw her approach. Rachel smiled, the first genuine smile in years, and gestured for them to relax. At ease, gentlemen. We're off duty. Her voice, when she spoke, carried command authority. The timid temp nurse who'd stood silent during grand rounds was gone. That version of her had been a mask. This version was the truth. She led them through the department, pointing out new protocols she'd implemented, a trauma training program she'd designed based on battlefield experience, systems now saving lives in civilian settings. When a student nurse knocked on her office door asking about procedure approaches, Rachel pulled out her training manual, the one she'd written herself, and walked through each step with the precision of someone who'd done it under fire, who understood that competence under pressure was the only real power that mattered. If you've never been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, subscribe and let us know. And if you've ever had to hide who you really are, just to keep the peace, that comment section is waiting for your story. Like, subscribe, and join the thousands discovering that heroism doesn't wear a badge. Sometimes it wears scrubs.